I asked you what you could play, not what you could compose.
The whole class laughed softly. A black boy, sitting at the back of the class, held his backpack as if trying to cling to something that was still his. The teacher called him to the front, handed him a guitar. Play, let the whole class know why you received the scholarship. He didn't argue. He didn't say a word. He just hung his head and started to play. 3 minutes later, tears quietly fell from those who had once mocked him. No one knew. He had been chosen by Elijah Carter himself to be his successor. You play guitar? I asked. For Chopin, not Kendrick. The words cracked through the classroom like a joke badly timed. Laughter followed, scattered and sharp, bouncing off the sterile white walls of the Performing Arts Academy's music room. Dante Evans stood still, hands tightening on the neck of his guitar. Not enough to break it, just enough to keep himself steady. He was used to the glances, used to the grins that meant, you don't belong here, but it was always different when it came from a teacher. Mr. Preston's smirk lingered just long enough to sting. Neatly dressed, clean-shaven and polished in posture, the man stood behind a piano like it was a podium. His blazer had elbow patches and his words had edges. I said, he repeated with a little more drama this time, Chopin. Dante didn't speak. He didn't need to. Instead, he walked slowly to the front, guitar slung over his shoulder, hoodie sleeves half covering the calluses on his fingers. He hadn't brought sheet music. He hadn't brought anything but the guitar and the hours of music he carried in his skin. The class looked amused, some rolled their eyes, others whispered. Someone near the back pulled out a phone, hit record, and smiled like they already knew the ending. What they didn't. Dante adjusted the strap. His fingers curled over the strings, light and steady, and then he played. It began soft, gentle plucks, not flashy, not fast, but full, rich, like the guitar was breathing something ancient, something bruised and holy. At first no one reacted. Then slowly the room changed. The giggles stopped, the whispers stilled. Mr. Preston's expression wavered. Even the air seemed heavier, as if it knew something important was being spoken in a language only a few could hear. The melody wound its way through the room like smoke in a church. There were no lyrics, but somehow Dante said everything. The nights he practiced in shelters, the mornings he busked outside the train station for breakfast money, the last moment he played for his grandmother before she passed. It was all in there. When the final note lingered in the silence, no one moved. Not at first. Dante looked up slowly, scanning the room. Eyes wet, mouths closed. The phone had stopped recording, and the boy who was supposed to be laughed at was now the one they couldn't look away from. Mr. Preston cleared his throat and reached for a clipboard like it was a lifeline. Well, that was interpretive. Dante didn't flinch. He just walked back to his seat, head held high, guitar still humming softly in his arms like it knew it had done something it wasn't supposed to, but had needed to anyway. That night, Dante returned to the shelter, laid his guitar beside him, and stared at the ceiling through the dim blue light of a cracked window. He didn't dream of applause. He didn't dream at all. But just before sleep found him, his phone vibrated once in his pocket. The message was short. My name is Elijah Carter. I sat in the back row today. The world doesn't know your name yet, but it will. I'd like to talk. Dante sat up, reading the message again and again. He didn't not yet. But his hands hovered over the strings again, gently this time. And for the first time in a long time he smiled. It took Dante 2 full days to respond. He didn't know what to say, or if he should say anything at all. The message from Elijah Carter sat in his inbox like a dare, like a door with no knob waiting to be pushed open. Back at school, no one said a word about what had happened in the music room. Not Mr. Preston, not the classmates who had laughed, but something had changed. They looked at Dante longer now, quieter, unsure of what they were seeing. But Dante, he had never been more sure. On the third morning, he replied, "I'll meet. Tell me when." The response came in less than 5 minutes. Saturday, 1 p.m., 1737 Marlowe Street. Ask for the back. No signature, no title, just instructions. Marlowe Street wasn't on any school brochure. It was the kind of neighborhood you passed through with your windows up. Faded murals, cracked sidewalks, shuttered storefronts with flyers layered thick on metal grates. Dante walked. Choir slung behind him, hoodie zipped, every step steady. He found the address. It looked like an old warehouse, but alive. Music leaked from behind the walls, jazz, blues, broken beats wrapped in truth. The brick was tagged with words like rise and voice and worth. He knocked. A man in a black beanie opened the door, gave him a nod, and stepped aside. "Go in, he's waiting." The inside was nothing like he expected. No gold trim, no glass panels, no reception desk. Just life. A beat-up baby grand piano sat in one corner. A wall covered in sound foam and handwritten lyrics. Another covered in faces, portraits of kids, teens, and grown folks caught mid-performance, their expressions full of grit and grace. And there, leaning against the back wall, stood Elijah Carter. He didn't look like the mogul people whispered about. Jeans, work boots, a long duster jacket. But his eyes, they saw everything. "You showed up," he said. "I almost didn't," Dante replied. "I would have understood." Elijah gestured toward a worn stool and a loop pedal setup. "Play." Dante froze. "Now?" Elijah shrugged. "I don't offer talk before I hear truth." Dante sat, tuned the guitar, and played, not a song, a sound, a space, a spill of memory and tension and want. When he finished, Elijah didn't clap. He leaned forward and said, "You don't need permission, you need room." Over the next hour, Elijah told Dante what Monroe was. Not a record label, not a charity, not a hustle. A space for the ones no one makes space for. It was how he started, Elijah said, after being turned away from 20 studios for sounding too real. He'd built Monroe with the money he earned mixing other people's stories, and saved it for voices that didn't get studio time, but had studio hearts. "You're not a prodigy," he said to Dante, eyes calm. "You're a mirror, and mirrors scare people." Dante swallowed. He didn't know how to respond. But he knew one thing: he'd never heard someone describe him so clearly before. When he left Monroe that day, the sun was lower, the street louder. But Dante felt different, like something had unlocked. Not fame, not opportunity, but recognition. He didn't know what was next. But for once it wasn't silence. The first time Dante stepped onto a stage, he almost didn't. The room was nothing like he imagined. No velvet curtain, no booming speakers. Just a rooftop bar with borrowed lights and 20 chairs in uneven rows, some plastic, some wood, one folding metal. The event was called Mike and Memory, and Monroe had invited him to open. Not headline, open. "It's just 15 minutes, Elijah had said. "Nobody here's trying to go viral. They're just trying to breathe." Dante didn't want fame, but he wasn't sure he wanted to be seen either. Backstage, which was really just a corner behind a crate of cables, he tuned his guitar. His hands shook, not because of fear, because of memory. He thought of his grandmother, the way she'd close her eyes when he played, as if music could wrap her bones. He thought of Mr. Preston, of that smirk, that dismissal. He thought of the shelter and the silence. He walked out before the MC even called his name. The mic squeaked as he sat. A single light overhead made it hard to see the audience. Maybe that was a gift. He didn't introduce himself. He didn't explain his song. He just played, It was raw, not perfect, a melody he hadn't planned, but one his hands knew better than his mouth. He layered chords with the loop pedal, built textures from memory, stacked harmonies like walls. He sang low, like gravel, rising only when the emotion forced him to. Lyrics about hunger, about invisible boys and concrete nights, about playing for people who didn't know the cost of applause, about the weight of being underestimated. He didn't cry, but someone else did. A woman near the front row wiped her eyes with the back of her sleeve. A man in a beanie stopped sipping his beer. Even the bartender, halfway through stacking cups, stood still. When Dante finished, he didn't look up right away. He didn't want validation. He wanted breath. And when it came in waves. Not cheers, but silence, deep, full, like respect without words. Backstage, Elijah waited. He didn't say good job. He didn't say you crushed it. He just held out a fist. Dante bumped it, then leaned against the wall, heart pounding. Elijah handed him a water bottle, then said quietly, "They heard you." The next morning, someone uploaded a clip. They didn't tag Dante. They didn't even know his name. They just captioned it, "This kid didn't even introduce himself and still made me cry." In 24 hours, it passed 100,000 views. In 48, it was on the home page of a major playlist curator's blog. By the weekend, a famous producer DM'd Monroe asking, "Who is he?" Dante didn't change overnight. He still took the bus, still tuned his own guitar, still used the same 3 strings he'd been scared to break for years. But the world had cracked open a little, and this time, instead of stepping back, he stepped through. They called him a prodigy now. Emails poured in, journalists, talent scouts, local radio, even a morning talk show reached out, asking if he'd perform something soulful for our Black History Month spotlight. Dante stared at the screen, numb. He hadn't changed. He was still the same boy Mr. Preston had dismissed, still the same kid patching his guitar with borrowed strings. But now, he was being packaged, framed, polished. At Monroe, Elijah warned him. "Be careful with the spotlight," he said. "It burns just as easy as it shines." Dante nodded, but he didn't understand it. Not yet. The first contract came from a boutique label in LA. They offered him a development deal, Code 4. "We'll shape you into what sells." They liked his raw sound, but wanted it with more hook, less pain. They asked if he'd wear something brighter, if he'd smile more during performance, if he could tone down the drama language. Dante read the pages and felt the edges cut his skin. They wanted the story, not the truth. The sound, not the scars. But the pressure didn't stop. His Monroe sessions got crowded. Photographers showed up without asking. Influencers asked to collab. One guy tried to freestyle over his loop mid-performance. The silence he once treasured was gone. And worse, it was being sold. Then came the backlash. Someone on social media posted a screenshot of Dante's Shelter record. The caption read, "Funny how deep his lyrics are when you realize he's literally been mooching off the state." It went viral. Dante's inbox turned ugly. Get a job, another sob story trying to profit off pity. You're not talented. You're just tragic. Elijah wanted to step in. Monroe offered to issue a statement, but Dante refused. "I don't want to fight trolls," he said. "I want to play." Still, the words clung. Even when the room applauded, he heard them. Even when the crowd stood, he felt small. One night he unplugged his guitar mid-set, walked off stage, didn't say a word. Elijah followed him to the alley behind the venue. "You okay?" Dante sat on the curb. "I'm tired of performing." Elijah nodded. "Then stop. Dante looked up. But the messages, the reach, what if stopping means I disappear? Elijah crouched beside him. You don't owe anyone your pain. You owe yourself your peace. The next day, Dante went silent. No posts, no shows, no appearances. People speculated. Was he burned out? Cancelled? Overhyped? But Dante wasn't broken. He was rebuilding. He spent the next month at Monroe alone. No audience, no cameras, just music and memory. He wrote quietly, played gently. He cried sometimes, not from sadness, but from the joy of still having something that was only his. Then, one morning, Elijah handed him a letter. Handwritten, no return address. Just 5 words on the front. Don't let them rename you. Inside was a check. And signed with a note. Start your own stage. Dante stared at the envelope and the empty room around him. Then the old guitar in his lap. And he smiled. Because this time he wouldn't just perform. He'd decide what the stage looked like. Dante never wanted a spotlight again. What he wanted was space, unfiltered, unclaimed, uncorrected. A place where the story didn't have to be squeezed into something clean enough to monetize. So he built one. It started as a pop-up. Monroe gave him the keys to an abandoned annex, once a print shop, now just walls and dust. He brought in folding chairs, borrowed lights, and an old coffee machine that only worked if you kicked it once on the side. He hung no banners. He printed no tickets. He called it the quiet room, not because it was silent, because it was sacred. People came, not just the polished, not just the wounded, but the curious, the stubborn, the ones who had been told they weren't enough, the ones who were never told anything at all. There were no auditions, no headliners. Just an open mic and one rule. Say it like no one's ever tried to hear you before. The first night, 20 people showed. By the 3rd week, they had to move outside. One night, a man stood and read a letter he wrote to the daughter he lost in a custody battle. Another night, a woman sang a lullaby she'd only ever sung to herself. And Dante, he didn't. He hosted, he listened, and when he played, it wasn't to impress. It was to remind the room that it was allowed to feel. It grew from there. A local teacher brought her students. A librarian offered bookshelves for a reading corner. One Sunday, a busker from 3 cities over showed up, played 4 minutes of flamenco and left without saying a word. The room clapped until he was out of earshot. What started as a refuge became a movement. Not on social media, but in whispers. In invitations scrawled on the backs of receipts. In rumors passed between kids too tired to shout and too full of truth to stay quiet. The quiet room became many things. A stage, a circle, a therapy session, a church for the voiceless. People started calling it the unshow because it wasn't about being seen. It was about being understood. Somewhere along the way, someone wrote an article, then a podcast did a feature, then a documentary crew asked to film. Dante said no. Not because he feared attention, but because he knew what happened when too many people pointed at something rare. They tried to shape it, own it, profit from it. And this wasn't for sale. So when someone asked him if he would consider scaling the format, he smiled kindly and said, "You don't franchise a confession booth." He never trademarked it, never called it a brand. But the quiet room grew anyway. It was one in Chicago, then Oakland, then Nairobi, each one a little different, each one just the same. They used chalk instead of mics, benches instead of chairs, candles instead of lights, but they all had the same rule. Say it like no one's ever tried to hear you before. Dante traveled to some, sat in the back, let the stories find him. He never brought a camera, He brought a guitar. He never asked permission to play. He waited for the moment that called for silence and filled it with something that wasn't quite a melody, but wasn't quite grief either. A tune, a note, a name unspoken. Years passed. He stopped getting recognized in public, not because people forgot, but because the story had grown bigger than his face. And that's what he wanted. He still played, but not on tour, not for deals, for children in hospital wards, for elders in homes no one visited, for a woman who asked for music while her chemo bag drained. He played at a vigil once. He played at a wedding when a bride asked for a song that felt like being brave without being loud. He played not as a performer, but as someone who once needed someone else's sound to remember he was still alive. And one night, alone in the quiet room long after the crowd had gone, he picked up the guitar again. He played a piece he never wrote down. It had no chords, no key, just feeling. And when he finished, he whispered into the empty space, "I forgive you." He'd know who it was for? Mr. Preston? His father? Himself? The echo was answer enough. That night he left his guitar on the chair. He walked out without looking back. And from that point on, the room played itself. Postlude, the echo. Years later, someone would ask him, "Why did you stop recording?" He would smile and answer, "Because not every story needs a witness. Some just need to be lived." By then he had gray at his temples. He had lines on his hands that weren't from strings anymore, but from time. The quiet room still stood. It had no sign, but people found it. Some came after funerals. Some came after divorces. Some came just because they needed somewhere that didn't need them to be anything. Dante rarely spoke now. He swept the floors, tuned the instruments, listened at the door. Sometimes he lit candles for strangers and sat in silence beside them until their breathing slowed. He became part of the furniture, not forgotten. Someone once described him in an article, "He doesn't lead, he makes space. He doesn't shine, he reflects." The quote went viral. He never read it. He was busy fixing a loose wire in the back of an amp that hadn't worked since 2003. One evening, a girl no older than 17 stepped into the room. She wore her grief like armor, spoke like a violin bow on broken strings. When she finished, there was no applause, just breath. And Dante, sitting quietly behind a crate of wires, nodded. The girl walked out lighter, and that was enough. That same night, someone left a note on the stool where he used to play. It read, "We don't know your last name. We know the shape of your silence. Thank you." He folded the note, tucked it into the lining of his coat, and hummed something under his breath as he turned off the lights. "Not a song, I promise." The room stayed open, because truth never needed a stage, just enough courage to be said out loud.